This presentation takes a look at monasticism. Monasticism is the idea of leaving the ordinary, everyday world, the ordinary, everyday business kind of world, to devote oneself to spiritual exercises, to prayer, scripture reading, worship services, that kind of thing. In other words, to leave the ordinary, everyday world and to become a monk and to live in a monastery. Just a quick word about vocabulary here. Today we distinguish between monks and nuns. We use the word monk to refer to a male monastic and a nun, and the word nun to refer to a female monastic. I use the word monastery for monasteries for men and convents for monasteries for women, but that's a little later distinguishment between the words that than the time we're dealing with. That word monk comes from a Greek word that means alone, monos, which means alone. And for a long time, in fact, until fairly recently, the word monk referred to both male or female monastics, and that's how I'm going to be using the word in the presentation and in class. In other words, monasticism means to leave the ordinary world to devote oneself to spiritual exercises in a monastery. On the screen, I've got some pictures of Christian monasteries. St. Catherine's is at the top of the page. It's a very famous monastery. You actually have a photograph of the monastery on page 38 in your textbook, and some other monasteries at the bottom. Monasticism is not unique to Christianity. The idea of monasticism we find in several world religions, not all of them, but many of them. This idea of living a separate life, living a life alone or separated from the ordinary world. The idea of monasticism within Christianity develops kind of early. Certainly not in the first generation or even the first century, but maybe by about the year 150 or so, we start to see communities that we can recognize as monastic communities. What comes to mind when you think about a monastery today is what you and I would call a sex-segregated monastery, where men are in one monastery and women are in another monastery. And that was the usual pattern, but there's all kinds of different approaches to monastic life. There are some, I guess what you and I would call co-educational monasteries with men and women living in the same community. A very common pattern among the Irish monks was to have family monasteries where you had men and women married, raising children, living in a communal life. There's a lot of variety out there. It's not all like what you see on the movies. Having said that, the general pattern is that you have men in one monastery and women in another monastery, although that's not universal. Well, like I said, the monasteries had developed, kind of early in the history of the church, but by the time we're talking about in this presentation and where we've reached in the course, at the time of the Carolingian Renaissance and actually a little bit earlier, there were a lot of critics of the monastery. A lot of people found problems with the monastery. The most vocal critic of the monasteries was a man named Benedict. You have a photograph of Benedict there on the screen to look at, I guess, idly as I talk about him. Benedict has a lot of complaints to make about the monastery, and he's the most vocal critic of the monasteries. For one thing, by the time we're talking about, the monasteries had become pretty wealthy places. Well, they've been around for a long time, and one of the rules of the way the world works is that the longer an organization has been around, the longer an institution has been around, the more time it has to accumulate wealth, and that's just a general rule about how the world works. To add to that accumulated wealth, nearly all the monasteries had gone into business for themselves. Nearly all the monasteries had gone into the booze-making business, making beer and wine. Making beer and wine makes a lot of sense if you want to live a monastic life, because you produce everything you need to make the product on the grounds of the monastery. The ingredients list for beer and wine is very simple. To make wine, all you need are grapes. That's the only ingredient you need to make wine. Yeast grows naturally on the skin of grapes. As soon as you burst the grape, the yeast on the skin of the grape comes into contact with the sugar in the juice and begins to ferment immediately. There's no such thing in the ancient world as what you and I call grape juice. It's not until the 19th century and pasteurization that you could stop that fermenting process. So the ingredients list is very short. All you need are grapes to make wine. Now, you have to know what you're doing, okay, or else you'll end up with something nasty tasting. But I'm not saying it's easy to make wine. I'm saying the ingredients list is simple, short, just grapes. To make beer, you have to have only a few more ingredients. To make beer, you have to have water. That's plentiful. You had to have some kind of grain to form the base of your beer, rye or barley or wheat, whatever grain you're using. And then you grow hops for the fermenting agent. But you can produce all that on the monastic grounds. Again, the ingredients list is simple. You have to know what you're doing when you're making beer, okay? If you don't know what you're doing, you'll end up making something that tastes like Miller High Life or something like that. I'm not a beer snob, trust me, but a man's got to draw the line somewhere, and Miller High Life is where I draw the line. You have to know what you're doing, but the ingredients list is short, okay? And then you only have to interrupt your monastic schedule once a year. Once a year, somebody from outside the monastery shows up with a wagon full of empty barrels for next year's production, offloads those, loads up the barrels that you made in the last year, and that you only interrupt the monastic schedule once. As you'll see a little bit later, the schedule is important for these people. On the screen, you've got a illumination from a manuscript showing a monk working a beer kettle. The connection between beer, wine, and the monastic life has been picked up in advertising in all kinds of different ways. You see some various advertisements for beer and wine on the labels and so on the screen there. There are some monasteries today that are still in the booze-making business. There's a Trappist monastery in Belgium. Here you see some a little bit fancier and a little more technologically up to date than the. Whoops, where am I going? Whoa, stop. There we go. A little more technologically up to date than this guy back here in this illuminated manuscript. Well, Benedict makes a number of criticisms of the monasteries, but if that was all that he did, well, then we wouldn't be talking about him 1,300 years later or whatever. Who cares about people who just complain about stuff? Benedict does something about it. He starts a string of monasteries. He becomes a monk himself, for one thing. He starts a string of monasteries that follow what's called the Benedictine rule, and you see that phrase on the screen there. The Benedictine rule is what we call all the rules that make up life in a Benedictine monastery. And the Benedictine rule will become the standard principle for the monastic life. It will be adopted and adapted by different monastic groups. Not all of them, but it just becomes kind of the standard principle of monasticism in Western Christianity. And at the center of life in a Benedictine monastery, at the center of the Benedictine rule, are a series of vows or promises. The way that the monasteries worked is that if you decided that you might want to try out a monastery, that might be the life for you, typically now, then you would go to a monastery, you would meet with whoever was in charge, and you would make an agreement for a year and a half to live in the monastery, to pretend to be a monk. You'd be what was called a novice. That comes from a Latin word that means new. You'd be new to the life. But you'd pretend to be a monk. You would live the life of the daily schedule. You will follow the rules and all that kind of thing. And then at the end of your probationary period, a year and a half, 2 years, whatever you'd agreed to, well, then you're asked very simply, well, do you want to stay or not? And if you say, no, this isn't the life for me. I thought it was going to be, but it's not for me. Well, then you leave and you go and you find a life somewhere else. But if you say, yes, this is the type of community I want to live in fact, I want to live here for the rest of my life, well, then in a simple ceremony before your brother monks or sister nuns, then you would make a series of promises, 3 vows. And the first one is at the center of the entire system, and that's a vow of obedience. Obedience to whom? Obedience to whomever's in charge of the monastery. If that's a man, that would be the abbot. If that's a woman, that would be the abbess. These are just male and female forms of the Latin word for parent, although it's a much more formal Latin word than even our English word parent is. So we could translate those words as father or mother, but they sound even more formal and Latin than those names even sound to us in English. A vow of obedience to the abbot. Now, these vows are supposed to do two things. First of all, they prove that you're serious, and then they free up time and energy during the day. They prove you're serious. Well, a vow of obedience proves that you're serious. You promise that you will obey whoever's in charge of the monastery. But it's even more serious than it might sound at first, because this is not a promise to obey a person, but a promise to obey an office. You promise that you'll obey whoever the abbot is. You see, you might join a monastery as a young person, and the abbot or the abbess is a pretty nice person, and you say, oh yeah, I'll do what they do. I'll do what they tell me to do. But then they die, and the new abbot is a real jerk. But you've already promised you're going to obey whoever the abbot is. You're promising to obey an office rather than a particular person, a particular individual person. And so it proves that you're serious. And then it frees up time and energy during the day. You don't have to worry about what you're going to do next. You don't have to keep yourself on task, because you'll live your life according to a schedule that the abbot sets up for you. When it comes time for the work part of the day, then you'll just do whatever the abbot tells you to do. You don't have to plan and worry about how you're keeping track of your time, because you surrender that part of your life to the abbot or the abbess. And so it proves you're serious and also frees up time and energy during the day. The second promise, the second vow, is a vow of poverty, which is oftentimes misunderstood, this vow of poverty. It's not a promise that you'll be poor. That's not quite it. It's a promise that you will never own any property at all. You give up that basic human right to owning property. You say, I'll never own anything. Not the clothes on my back, nothing. From now on, there's nothing I'll ever be able to look at and say, that belongs to me. Everything belongs to the monastery. Everything belongs to the community. And I give up my basic human right to own property. Not only will you be dirt poor, you won't even own dirt. You'll never own anything. You just trust the monastery to provide for you. That when you need new clothing, you'll get new clothing. You don't have a retirement plan. You just trust that when you get too old to work, then your brother monks or sister nuns will take care of you until you die. Well, that demonstrates that you're serious, and also frees up time and energy during the day. If you're like most people, especially college students, you probably spend a lot of time worrying about money, especially if you're cheap like me. Ordinary people don't understand how much work it takes to be cheap. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. But if you just give up ownership at all, then, it proves you're pretty serious and also frees up time and energy during the day. The third vow is one that's almost always misunderstood, and that's the vow of celibacy. In fact, about any time you hear someone use the word celibacy, they probably don't quite understand what it means. Celibacy is oftentimes confused with another decision, another moral value, and that's chastity. I've put chastity up there on the screen. Chastity means a decision to avoid sexual intercourse outside of marriage. That's what most people think celibacy means. But celibacy means, celibacy is a promise to avoid any kind of romantic relationship at all. It's a promise to never have a boyfriend or girlfriend, never to fall in love with someone, that if you begin to feel those romantic feelings developing for someone, then you put a stop to it. You keep control of your emotions. You just don't go down that road. You keep such control of your emotions that if you feel those feelings developing for someone, or even someone from your past that comes to mind, then you just keep control of your thoughts, you keep control of your emotions, and you refuse to let those romantic feelings develop. You refuse to let yourself fall into love. That's one of the things I say in class sometimes when I have a class and discussing this. And when I talk about being able to control your emotions and choosing not to fall in love with someone, that the younger faces in the classroom, I tend to get this kind of reaction. What? Huh? What? What? Helping, choosing who you fall in love with, controlling your emotions, and the not so younger faces in the classroom are doing this. It's true. You can choose to control your emotions. You can choose whether you want to fall in love with someone. You don't have to marry the axe murderer just because they're so dreamy, you know. That's something maybe you just have to live a while to learn. Um, there's some things in life like that. But anyway, this is a decision to complete that process forever for everybody, that you'll keep such tight control of your emotions you won't allow those romantic feelings to develop. Well, that certainly demonstrates you're serious, because that's hard. Okay, that's hard work, hard emotional work. It shows you're serious. You're giving up something that a lot of people have found brings a lot of pleasure to life, being in love and all that kind of thing. And then it frees up time and energy during the day. We can have a lot of fun with that one, right? How much time do a lot of people spend worrying about the boyfriend and girlfriend thing? Well, if you just make a decision to put that out of your life, well, then that frees up a lot of time and energy during the day. All three of these vows free up time, free up energy. To do what? To do what Benedict says monks and nuns should be doing. And that's what Benedict calls the Opus Dei. This is another Latin phrase, although we're fast running out of Latin phrases in the course. But this phrase, Opus Dei, is a Latin phrase. It means, opus is a Latin word that means work. Dei means of God, the work of God. And if you ask Benedict, okay, what is it that, in other words, monks do God's work? Well, you say, well, what is God's work? Okay, it's a nice Latin phrase, Opus Dei, the work of God. What is the work that monks and nuns are supposed to be doing? Benedict defines the Opus Dei in the famous phrase, to pray and work. What should monks be doing during the day? Praying and working. Well, of course, there's other stuff you have to do too, because you're a human being. You have to sleep. You have to eat. You have to go to the bathroom. You have to wash yourself so you remain healthy. There are those kinds of things. But for the amount of time you have in your day to control, you devote that time to prayer and work. Benedict, in the Benedictine rules, has the abbot or the abbess come up with a schedule for the monastery. And after even just a couple of days, as a novice living this schedule, your body learns the schedule. You always know what comes next. I'm going to give you a typical Benedictine schedule. I don't want you to try to write it down, and I didn't put anything on the screen, excuse me, because I don't want you to worry about the details here. It's just a typical Benedictine schedule. But listen to it, see if you don't catch on to like the rhythm of the daily life. A typical schedule. Now, every monastery would have its own schedule, but I'm just giving you the typical one. Typically, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you get up. I'm out right there. 2 o'clock in the morning, you get up, and it's into a chapel for a prayer service that lasts for about an hour. And then it's off to the library for a time of reading and writing and studying. The library, or the Latin word that the monks used, the scriptorium. To script means to write something. Whether you see a monk in a scriptorium or in the library. It's off to the library for about an hour, for a couple hours of reading and writing and studying. Benedict realized how important it had been that those Irish monks had kept reading and writing alive during those dark ages. And so Benedict figures, well, civilization might come to an end again. And so might be useful to have somebody who's already decided they're going to keep the knowledge of the past alive. They're going to keep the science and the technology and the medical knowledge and philosophy and theology and poetry and literature and the knowledge of the past. They're going to keep it alive. So every day, Benedict's monks and nuns are in the library. They're reading so they don't forget how to read. They're writing so they don't forget how to write. They're copying books that the books they have are going to continue to survive, and they're going to study. And this is one of the big draws of the monastic life for a monk or a nun in the medieval period, to have an opportunity to learn how to read and write. If you're an intellectual type, and you're a kid in the Middle Ages, and you like thinking about stuff, and that's just your personality. You're an intellectual. And you like thinking about stuff, and maybe your people in your village make fun of you for daydreaming because you just kind of drift off and think about things, but that's just who you are. And you find out about reading. Reading, that it's almost like magic, that if you hold a book and you know what to do, you can just look at a book and someone else's ideas go through your head. You might not have thought of that before, but that's kind of like magic, really. That's what reading is. If you know what you're doing, you look at marks on a piece of paper, and somebody else's ideas go through your head, and you can have a conversation with Plato, who's been dead for 1,000 years by now. You can have a conversation with all kinds of people. And if that intrigues you, and you're living in the Middle Ages and you're an intellectual kid, well, there's only a limited number of options. You can go to Charlemagne's Palace School. It's going to cost you some money. You can go to one of the other schools that is popping up, but that's going to cost you a bit of money too. Or you become a monk or a nun. And because the first thing you do as a novice is that you're going to learn how to read and write. And, well, part of that decision, am I going to stay in the monastery? Am I going to devote myself to this community? Well, if you want access to the books in the library, you've got to make that commitment. And that's one of the draws to the monastic life. Monks and nuns tend to be intellectual types. They tend to be intellectual types today, and they tended to be intellectual types in the Middle Ages. And this is one of the attractions. Well, okay, back to the schedule. We got up at 2 o'clock, off to the chapel for an hour's worship service. Then it's off to the library for a couple of hours of reading and writing and studying, copying. Then it's back to the chapel for another worship service. Then it's back to the library for more time of reading, writing, and studying. Until it's time for the work part of the day, when it's finally bright enough outside to do the work part of the day, and that's about 8 o'clock in the morning in Northern Europe. And so this begins the work part of the day. There's usually about 6 hours of work, physical labor. Some monks or nuns might be working in the kitchen or in the dairy shed or tending to the grapevines, a number of different things to do. And what do you do during the work part of the day? Whatever the abbot tells you to do. That's just what you go and do. After about 6 hours of physical labor, then it's back to the monastery for the mealtime for the day. And then it's back to the chapel for another worship service. Then it's back to the library for more reading, writing, studying, thinking about things. Then it's back to the chapel for 2 services back to back. They're separate services. They're structured differently, but one begins as soon as one ends. Evening prayer and then complinants called. By the end of that service, it's about 6 o'clock in the evening, so it's time to go to bed. Going to bed at 6 o'clock in the evening makes getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning a lot easier because you're getting 8 hours of sleep. But the symbolism there is significant. You're going to bed when it's still light outside. You're getting up practically in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning when it's pitch dark outside. But you see, that's a reminder every day that this is not the ordinary world. In the ordinary world, people get up when it's light outside, and they go to sleep when it's dark outside. But the monastic life is different. Well, if you keep track of the schedule there's roughly about 6 hours of prayer services in that schedule, which is an awful lot. But that's one of the draws of the monastic life. Monks and nuns tend to be religious types too, and it's a chance to have a life where you can devote yourself to that kind of thing. The services in the chapel, in the monasteries by the time of Benedict, are what are called sung services, where everything in the service is set to music. The scripture readings, the prayers, and so on is set to music. And set to a particular type of music, a type of music called Gregorian chant. Depending on which section you are in, I've either already talking about Gregorian chant to you in class or will be talking to you about Gregorian chant. And we'll see how the worship services in the monastery actually lead us to something new to talk about. It might surprise you what comes out of these worship services in the monasteries.